Hello and welcome to another of the Vedanta Society of New York Saturday lectures. Our guest speaker today is Pravrajika Virajaprana, a senior nun of the Vedanta Society of Northern California Convent, San Francisco, where she has been since 1972. She gives lectures and serves in various capacities, both in the San Francisco Temple as well as at the Olima Retreat. She regularly gives talks on ways to deepen individual spiritual practice. Mataji is a very popular lecturer on Vedanta, and we are most grateful that she has taken time from her schedule to speak to us today. She has contributed many articles to religious journals on such topics as Peace on Earth, Is It Possible, and Nonviolence in a Turbulent World. She edited and compiled the book, The Photographs of Swami Vivekananda. In March of last year, we were fortunate to have her give 2 talks in person at our center here in New York, and many of us were able to spend some very enjoyable time in her company over dinner. Today, we welcome her remotely with the hope that in time we can welcome her again in person. The subject of her talk today is dissolving boundaries. Welcome, Mataji.
Thank you. Thank you. So our subject today is dissolving boundaries. Spiritual teachers of different traditions speak not only of a timeless state, but also a state that is devoid of all boundaries. Boundaries, all boundaries, are mental constructs and are intimately associated with time. Now, in an enlightened state, beyond space and time, an individual's sense of identity expands far beyond his or her small confines of body and mind. And this experience of supreme identity, unitive consciousness, non-duality, is referred to by all mystics in various ways. As Sri Ramakrishna humorously used to say, all jackals howl alike. Now, when the sages mention eternity, they are not referring to an indefinite amount of time, a long, long time, but of an awareness that is totally devoid of time. That which is timeless is eternal. It's outside of time. And as one of the great Zen masters said, if you want to know what eternity means, it is no further than this moment. If you fail to catch it in this present moment, you will not get it, however many times you are reborn in hundreds of thousands of years. So this eternal now, this timeless moment, the present, is all that actually exists. The past and the future, as we experience them, are illusions of a boundary superimposed upon the eternal now. It appears to split eternity into, say, yesterday versus tomorrow, before versus after, events which have happened and which are about to happen, and so on. But if you think about it deeply, in our immediate awareness, there is no time really. In one way, memory, that complex mental imaging process, is what gives us the sense of time. So through the commingling of memory, along with successive mental changes, we impose a boundary upon the timeless present. And with this idea, we come to this evening's subject, the subtle realm of boundaries. So what are these boundaries? And how do they come? And most importantly, how do we dissolve them? Now, we can say at the outset that boundaries, like time, are pure illusions. They seem to separate that which is inseparable. There are no real dividing lines between things. At the molecular level, every entity in the world is interpenetrated by every other entity. And according to quantum science, what we see as actual boundaries do not actually exist. So boundaries are not part of reality, but they are the way we map and edit reality. Now, in Vedantic language, very simply, this is considering the impermanent, that which is transitory, for something that is permanent, unchanging. Swami Vivekananda said the whole universe is one. There is only one self in the universe, only one existence. And that existence is called by different names. All mental and physical forms. Swamiji says it is unchanged. All the changes that we see are only apparent. It is name and form alone that one thing is differentiated from another. So Swamiji's conclusion is that the name and form alone constitute difference. Now, the problem arises for us when we take these fabrications of name and form and mistake them for reality itself. Because this results in the actual world appearing as if it were fragmented and disjointed instead of the seamless reality which is the truth. Now let's analyze how we can substantiate this very bold statement. So first of all, what are these boundaries? The initial, the most primary boundary that we have, that we are aware of, is myself, my idea of self. Everything that we think, everything that we feel, everything that we do originates here. The boundary of self is the most cherished. We've spent years in nourishing it and defending it. It's the boundary that establishes ourself as a separate being. Now, we're extremely reluctant to let it go, but at death, we are forced to let it go. It's the first boundary that we draw when we are aware enough to distinguish between things, and it's the last one that we erase at death. It's so fundamental that all other boundaries depend upon it. Every subsequent boundary that we draw concerning ourselves and the world presuppose this fundamental boundary of self. Now, the psychiatrist Arthur Deichmann, the author of the book, The Observing Self, Mysticism and Psychotherapy, he offers a psychological paradigm that's rooted in Eastern mystical tradition. And it enables Western psychology to come to terms with the essential issues of meaning and the evolution of self. The self derives its sense of identity through 4 domains of experience. What are those domains? Thought, feeling, emotion, action, and the observing self. Now, the experience that we all gain through these various aspects convinces us of our locality in space and of our unique psychological identity. Now, memory, as we said earlier, is one of the ways in which we sense the passage of time. And it applies to the first 3 domains of self: thinking, feeling, experiencing. It convinces us of our continuity in time. So the empirical self, as we know it is embodied, it's spatially located with some sense of continuity. Now let's consider this in a little more detail. The thinking self is in control. It's the command center, it's the CPU, or the conceptual self, which brings us the idea of who and what we think we are. In other words, it's how we conceive of ourselves, which may be and often is totally different from how other people perceive us. This conceptual self is the person. And incidentally, person is derived from the word persona, which means a mask. It's really just a mental image. This persona masks our true self. This is where we draw our first boundary, and around what we consider to be me, as opposed to everything that is not me. Now, this is actually a simple process in operation. We draw a mental line across the entire field of our experience. And then we neatly divide everything on the inside of that line, that boundary line, calling it myself, while everything on the other side of that line has nothing to do with me. This is our ordinary state of existence. And further, if we consider various classes of sentient and insentient beings, we know, for example, that we belong to Homo sapiens and not to the plant kingdom, for example. And we say, I am this and I'm not that. When we have an identity crisis, we can't figure out where to draw the boundary line. In other words, our self-identity depends completely on where we draw that boundary. And for the great mystics, the sages, the realized souls, their boundary is the infinite. Now, according to the text Vedanta Sara, when a person is unrefined or prakrita, his sense of self is actually tied up with external objects, say a husband or a wife or a son, daughter, even a home. If something happens to that person or to that object, we feel that's actually happening to me. A slightly more refined state is we don't feel things actually to be myself, but they belong to me. So it's my computer, it's my cell phone, etc. It's not part of my primary boundary, but it's part of myself. It's mine. And it's the source of all of our attachments. Our whole life is geared to reinforcing this primary boundary. From the moment we are born and issued a birth certificate, to having to prove who we are when we go to the bank or to the airport with our photo IDs or our iris scans or fingerprints, to being issued a death certificate on our way out. At each stage, our physical existence or non-existence has to be verified. We simply can't escape from it. Everything stems from this very first procedure of drawing a boundary line between my physical body and mind, which I consider myself, and that which is not myself. Now, the second domain of self is the emotional self. In this aspect, it's the closest to the core of our being. You know, our feelings seem to constitute a self that's more vital, it's more active, it's more alive than the thought of self or the thinking self. All the mystics refer to the heart being the center of the self, the center of the light within. It's very central to the core of our being. And within this boundary, we feel very intensely about some people or some issues, and we're completely indifferent to others. So all of our happiness, our disappointments, our joys, our sorrows, everything depends upon our identification with this emotional boundary. It's the main driving force behind the next level of self, which is our functional self, the active self. This third domain of self involves action. It encompasses our entire realm of experience. Now, we're all quite aware that we do things in what appears to be a very stable, concrete world. It is through our physical body, which is identified with the sensations in the world around us and our location in space, that we experience this world. The boundary of our functional self is our body. And intellectually, our mind is our mental boundary. So very simply, all three domains of self, thinking, feeling, and the experiencing self, have predetermined boundaries. Now, another major aspect of the primary boundary is that we divide our experience into three. The first aspect of that is the subject, the thinker, the feeler, the one who experiences. In other words, our ego. The second is the object, that which is thought about, that what we feel, what we experience, and is essentially separate from me. It exists out there somewhere, or so we think. And three, the actual process of seeing, thinking, feeling, etc. So there's a connection between the two, between the subject and the object. And we create a space between ourselves and the environment where actually none exists. Whenever we look for a separate entity apart from experience, it actually vanishes into the experience itself. When we search for the experiencer, we can only find another experience. So the inner subject and the outer object are two names for one experience. Take an example. Take hearing as an example. Now, say you close your eyes and you listen to all the cacophony of sounds around you, maybe car alarms blaring, or dogs barking, or children calling out, or the birds singing. No matter how hard you try or how alert you are, you begin to notice one thing. You cannot hear the hearer of the sounds. The hearer cannot be objectified. The Pravrajika Upanishad says you cannot see the seer of sight. You cannot hear the hearer of sounds. You cannot think the thinker of thoughts, and you cannot know the knower of knowledge. Now this brings us to the fourth domain, the observing self, which interestingly in many ways corresponds to the fourth state of consciousness in Vedanta known as Turiya. It is of an entirely different order. The observing self, or Turiya, is that transparent center, that which is aware. So the fourth self is the most important of all the domains because it is prior to thought, to feeling, and to action. Regardless of what experience we happen to have, nothing is more central than the self that observes it. Now, the most important fact about the observing self is that it cannot be objectified. It is impossible to locate the self, to establish its boundaries. I mean, whatever we conceptualize is already an object of awareness. It's not awareness itself. So the conclusion is the observing self can be intuitively known or experienced, but it cannot be located. It cannot be seen. It cannot be objectified. It has no limits. It has no boundaries, whereas everything else in the relative universe does. Now, interestingly, our everyday consciousness contains a transcendent element that we seldom recognize. And why? Because we have limited ourselves by etching innumerable boundaries in our consciousness, so that the very ground of our existence, our true nature, this unitive consciousness, remains hidden from view. And what's the result of that? Our pure, true self then functions, as it were, pragmatically on all these levels with different boundaries and limitations and identities. And it is in and through these various identities we attempt to answer the question, who am I anyhow? So how did these boundaries come? Well, this is equivalent to asking why or how does Maya come? And as we know, this is an unanswerable question for many reasons. But the most important pragmatic reason is that our minds that are raising this question are products of Maya. We can never find an answer, and Swami Vivekananda says there is no answer. Maya is simply a statement of facts as they are. But even within this limitation, I think we can find some reasons for these illusory boundaries, which we take so seriously. Now, according to Advaita Vedanta, as we all know, there is only one reality, one existence, this vast ocean of homogeneous consciousness. It is one, it's undivided, it's unchanging, self-luminous. It's always fully manifest because it is permanent. You can call this reality divinity. It's equally present and fully manifest everywhere at all times. And Swami Vivekananda says, all you have to do is open your eyes and see him. Well, this is more easily said than done. And why? Because superimposed upon this pure existence, through this cosmic power of Maya, are all the boundaries of names and forms and shapes and colors, sounds and tastes and sensations, the whole gamut of our sensate and intellectual experience. All of these divisions arise from the apparent bifurcation of consciousness into subject and object, as we've already pointed out. I who know things and things that I know. Now, in his lecture, Sankhya and Vedanta, Swamiji said all difference is due to time, space, and causation. These are the constituent elements of the mind, Swamiji says. No mentality is possible without them. You can never think without time. You can never imagine anything without space. And you can never have anything without causation. So these are the forms of the mind. You take them away and the mind itself does not exist. All difference, Swamiji concludes, therefore, is due to the mind, which brings us back to where we started this talk. The mind is the culprit behind the division, which distorts our perception and makes us feel separate from others. Now, our thinking, which involves language, is one of the main boundaries. Words, thoughts, ideas are actually nothing but boundaries. For whatever and whenever we think, we talk, we create boundaries. I feel that I am, that you are, he is, she is. Everything in the universe, all with very distinct, clean borders. And in our ordinary, unexamined state of existence, this is what we actually perceive to be true. And in fact, it is true, momentarily. So the nature of the mind is to vibrate. Just floats on the surface, accepting the boundaries that are imposed by our senses and our mind, instead of penetrating into the heart of things. And as far as we are concerned, the center of this perception is our own limited ego, the pivotal point of our universe, our primary boundary, which spreads forth, and ultimately our whole world of multiplicity is hemmed in with endless boundaries. Now, if we pause for a moment and analyze our thoughts, we can observe how our ordinary thinking fragments our experience. We habitually make arbitrary divisions, which are really only a matter of convenience. We take the arbitrary boundaries that we have drawn as solid facts, and then we divide and subdivide the universe into millions of categories. Then this fragmentation seems to assume an existence of its own, independent of our thinking and feeling, and even our willing, and this is how boundaries arise. Now, our lives are almost completely spent in drawing these boundaries around things and people. And hence, by definition, we live in a world of duality and opposites. Consider, for example, a few boundaries that we draw between states and countries and mountain ranges and oceans. A striking example to me is Kanyakumari, where you have a body of water and 3 oceans meet at one point: the Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal, and the Arabian Sea. 3 bodies of water meet in one place with 3 different names. In San Francisco, if you drive across the Golden Gate Bridge, suddenly you're no longer in San Francisco County, you're suddenly in Marin County, somewhere in the middle of the bay. And then there are many examples of disputes arising over territorial boundaries. A prime one right now is Israel and Palestine. And then there was the Great Wall of China in East and West Berlin. And then there's the boundary between the United States and Mexico. Our lives are filled with examples of how we take cognitive knowledge, which is based on arbitrary boundaries and separation, to be real knowledge when it is actually based on illusion. Now, there's a rather old book, which I find very interesting, called The Spectrum of Consciousness by a Western psychologist named Ken Wilber. And he discusses 2 ways of knowing, cognitive and intuitive. And the same idea comes in Swami Vivekananda's Jnana Yoga. Now, Wilber calls cognitive knowing symbolic or inferential knowledge. He refers to it very simply as the map-territory relationship. So the territory, according to him, is the actual world, whereas the map is any symbolic notation that represents, say, some aspect of that territory. But the obvious point is the map is not the territory. If you want to travel, say, to Yellowstone National Park, you're not going to get there by flipping through a number of road maps or going online, taking a virtual tour. You have to pack up your car or take a bus and drive there. An even subtler map, as I mentioned earlier, is our everyday language, in which a name represents an idea of the form. The name and the boundary it imposes are not the same thing. The word ice cream will not satisfy your sweet tooth. Sri Ramakrishna gives the example of an almanac. He says, doesn't matter how much you squeeze it, you will not get a drop of water from it. In the same way, all ideas about reality, no matter how exalted, are circumscribed. They're limited, and they're not reality itself. They only describe it. They point to it. But because we assume that boundaries, which create the feeling of separateness, are real, we ascribe reality to something that is nothing more than a shadow. Now, the peculiar thing about any boundary, no matter how simple or how complex it is that it only delineates an inside versus an outside, not of two separate things, but of the same thing. Now imagine, say, a convex and a concave line, say like half of a parenthesis. Well, the very convex implies that the other side of the same line is going to be concave. They're not two separate lines. You can see where we're going with this. They're actually two aspects of one reality. So in truth, all opposites, all of the pairs of opposites share an implicit identity. They are inseparable and mutually interdependent. So say psychologically, we run after pleasure and we fear pain. And we frantically pursue goodness and we obsess on evil. We really tenaciously cling to life and we're terrified of death. So none of these are two separate emotions or mental processes. They're two ends of one event. An example is giving of, say, buying and selling. You can't buy a Mercedes-Benz unless someone is selling cars. And similarly, a Mercedes-Benz cannot be sold unless there's a prospective buyer. So you can say, okay, we can view buying and selling as separate, but they are also an inseparable event. Now, this process applies to the whole spectrum of duality. The obverse and reverse of the same coin, to use a threadbare expression. The scientific explanation is that we can no longer really speak or think of an object being located in space or happening in time. We can only talk about a space-time occurrence. We can distinguish between life and death, between pleasure and pain, between good and evil, but it's impossible to separate them. Another way of looking at this is to observe the natural world. You know, lines exist, say, between the shore and the ocean or the sky and the earth. So these lines divide the two, but they simultaneously unite and join the two as well. However, intuitive or non-dual knowledge is a territory without boundaries. It is a type of perception, we can say it bypasses the usual sensory pathways and the mind. It doesn't split up the universe. Non-dual knowledge requires a shift of identity. It is being and becoming. It's experiential. Mystics perceive the universe as a whole without the demarcations and fragmentations and characteristics of the symbolic map mode. It is unifying. Each so-called separate thing is not an aspect of the whole, it is itself the whole. We are that infinite being. Therefore, the mystics emphasize not pitting the opposites against each other, but transcending them. Not one versus the other, but entering the center of awareness that rises above both. Or, to put it another way, discovering a ground that encompasses both. The end result in either case is the same: unitive consciousness. Ultimate reality is a union of the opposites. And since it is expressly the boundaries which we superimpose on reality that slice it up into innumerable pairs of opposites, the mystic's experience that reality is free from the pairs of opposites is a way of saying that truth is free from all boundaries. According to the Gospel of St. Thomas, they said to him, "Shall we then, being children, enter the kingdom?" And Jesus said to them, "When you make the two one, when you make the inner as the outer, and the outer as the inner, and the above as the below, and when you make the male and the female into single one, then you shall enter the kingdom." That kingdom is the territory of no boundary awareness. When we remove our illusory boundaries through spiritual practices and ultimately experience, we will see here and now the universe as an organic, holistic unity, a complete harmony of opposites. It's our natural state. As Sri Sarada Devi, the Holy Mother, used to say, when one realizes God, nothing unusual happens. We become what we already are. We don't grow two horns. But our discrimination becomes sharp as an edge of a razor. And this brings us to our last point, and to the most important point. How do we dissolve these boundaries? Now, the simple answer is to erase the primary boundary between our true self and our not self. Remove the brick of the ego and the edifice collapses. Well, this collapsing of the edifice is the nati, not this side of our spiritual practice. And these practices are described in negative terms to break our infatuation with or cut through all the associations that we normally have. Now, initially, as I said in the beginning, we separate our small self from everything considered outside of oneself, saying, this is me in here, and I'm separate from everything out here. But a spiritual seeker separates the true self from everything outside, including the ego. So all spiritual practice is directed toward the attenuation of the ego. And the ego boundary, like all other illusions, doesn't exist really. It is only seems to exist. Sri Ramakrishna compared the ego to an onion. And in the gospel, he says, if one analyzes oneself, one doesn't find anything, such as an eye. Take an onion, for example. First of all, you peel off the red outer skin, and then you take the thick white skins out, peel these off one after the other, he says, and you won't find anything inside. Now, this practice of negating the boundary of I and mine in Vedanta has a big name, apavada, de-superimposition. Swami Vivekananda says, dehypnotize yourself. This is the process. When we sincerely apply it, it removes the illusion that we are limited, separate beings and reveals the truth that we are infinite. The other side of our practice is the positive side, asti, Asti, it is, it is. It's the positive affirmation. We are that divine being right now. Nothing can ever obstruct our real nature. It is our feeling and experience of existing as a separate individual that is an obstacle to higher consciousness. Nothing more. We are always that perfect self. It's ever present. We simply aren't recognizing it, that's all. As Sri Ramakrishna said, when will I be free? When I shall cease to be. And the Buddhist sage Padmasambhava put it this way: if the seeker himself, one sought, cannot be found, thereupon is attained the goal of seeking and also the end of the search itself. So the essence of the mystical message is simple and straightforward. The truth is there are no boundaries. When our self-identity expands, everything once thought to be outside of myself is included within myself. Our sense of identity shifts and envelops everyone, everything. Then there is nothing left outside of oneself, nowhere to draw any sort of boundary. In that experience, all artificial boundaries that we've been speaking about are removed. There is this awareness of an underlying unity that pervades everything. And this is experience of all mystics. It's very much manifest in the life of Sri Ramakrishna. We can see that. Sri Ramakrishna experienced complete unity with all beings. Even with tender grass, when someone walked over, he felt the pain in his own chest. How do you explain that? A boatman beat another boatman. He had the marks that someone had beat him. So these incidents in the mystics' lives are actually themes for our meditation. This is the truth. As the Isha Upanishad proclaims about one who has dissolved all boundaries, the wise one beholds all beings in the self, and the self in all beings. So to the seer or to the mystic that has become identified with the self, what delusion or what sorrow can there be for one who beholds the oneness of the universe? Thank you.
Mataji, what about those of us who are on the path of bhakti? How do we get rid of these boundaries?
How do we get rid of what?
The boundaries. If we're following the path of bhakti, which is basically a dualistic path.
Well, I would debate that the path of bhakti is a dualistic path, but aside from that, the basic psychological mechanism is the same, no matter what path we follow. In terms of removing our boundaries, it's not just a path for a jnani. It's the path for any spiritual seeker. So it's just a matter that you have to adapt it to your own individual bhakti practices. So, for example, one of the main reasons for bringing some of these examples is for all of us to think about what we kind of take for granted, certain observations, patterns of thought. You know, when we're babies, when we first come into this world, we don't distinguish between one thing and another. And we learn as we grow, we learn from our parents, from our teachers, and so on and so forth, and from observation. And so many things, as Sri Ramakrishna says, are put into an individual's mind as they grow. That's why he loved the company of young people, young men, young people who were untouched by the world, etc. So those of us who already have some of these predetermined boundaries etched in our consciousness, it doesn't matter which path, spiritual path you follow, we have to change the basic mechanism of how we think and how we observe things. So say, for example, in the path of bhakti, if one is, depends on if you're doing formal worship or you spend time doing japa or prayer, the actual practice itself, regardless of what the end goal of your practice is, will help you to negate some of these boundaries just through your spiritual practice, because you're focusing on the divine. In which form you focus on the divine, in my opinion, doesn't matter. Whether it's a formless God, or whether it's a form of God, or it's the deity, whether you worship, or whether you just sit and simply discriminate and study, the actual practice itself is immaterial. Does that make any sense?
Well, I was thinking about Ramakrishna's idea of the ripe ego, which maintains a sense of separateness, but it's no longer what he calls the evil ego that has strong boundaries.
Right. Of course. I mean, when Sri Ramakrishna, you have to remember that when Sri Ramakrishna gives this example of a ripe ego, a person who has a ripe ego, and he gives the example of Shankaracharya and any spiritual master that retains somewhat of his identity to teach the world, that's quite an advanced state. So those of us who are struggling to, I mean, as he said, no matter how you think you've gotten rid of your ego, you cut down the people tree and the next day it's starting to sprout. So his point is, it's not that easy. And that's why I said, when Swamiji said, oh, just open your eyes and see him, we should be able to do that, but we cannot do that. It takes years of spiritual practice to separate ourselves, from these particular ideas that are etched firmly in our consciousness. So if you can achieve getting a ripe ego, you're doing quite well. You don't need to worry.
Thank you.
Pranam Mataji. I was just wondering if the boundaries, is that alike to the obstacles, or obstacles in spiritual life something different? Or are they intertwined?
I think they are intertwined. Boundaries, I mean, as I said, this is a mental, you can say it's a mental operation, so to speak. And so all of our various, we call them obstacles in our path, they're mental barriers in some form, right? Okay. So all of the mental barriers are going to involve, these boundaries. And the point is, if our primary boundary, just think of yourself, as an individual, the more we identify ourselves, as Swami Vivekananda used to say, as individuals, as long as we hang on to that kind of identity, then these boundaries are not going to dissolve so easily. So the point is, through our spiritual practice, we separate ourselves slowly from all of the things that we're entrenched in and identified with, all of the attachments that we have. It's not that suddenly we're going to go out and, we're going to become whatever monks and nuns and be sitting under a tree. It's not that. We have to do it in and through wherever we are in life. It doesn't matter whether we're householders or monks or nuns. That part doesn't matter. It's a mental process. That's what matters. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the boundaries are very much associated with obstacles in our life, for sure. Does that help?
Yeah. So is it just a process of detaching ourselves, like stepping back and observing ourselves?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because the more that you practice meditation and the more that you go through these mental processes, you find that you'll see that there's the separation comes, and so that you can observe these things more readily in yourself, in your thinking, you see, and even in your relationships with other people. So when you think of things, as I said, just ordinary things in our life, how we superimpose boundaries upon things that don't exist, whether we call this country that or this ocean this, we give names to things and we define things when in the universe there's no names and no definitions. There's no boundaries, actually. We're the ones that put the boundaries everywhere. What's the difference between the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean? See, we give it the name and we say it goes from here to here and here to there and so on. I mean, and now science is coming more to this with all of their intergalactic, space travel and this and the expanding universe. So these scientists that are thinking in these huge terms are just at the very edge of some of these ideas of a universe without boundaries. So the main point is we have to understand that the boundaries exist within our own minds. We're the ones that put the boundaries. Yeah. Just like Swami Vivekananda said, everything is because of the mind. It's the mind that puts these things.
Thank you, Mataji.
Pranam Mataji.
Yes, hi.
I liked your lecture very much.
Good.
I have one question.
Yes.
That the usage of your word mystic.
Yes.
You have used it for almost everybody, that the mystics say that, mystic do that. What do you mean by a mystic in your talk?
Okay, so in Vedanta, the word mystic is equivalent to the word rishi, or it's equivalent to the word saint in the Christian tradition. So every religious tradition has terminology for a person who has excelled on the path of spirituality. So you could define a mystic as one who has had this experience that we're talking about, who has had religious realization, who has realized something within themselves that is beyond their body and mind, that they have come in touch with their spiritual center. That's a mystic.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Does that make it clear?
Yeah, it does, because usually mysticism we call when we see something, or darshan, or like other things which is not the realization, we call that mysticism. So I was I wasn't sure what you mean, but you are absolutely clear.
Good.
Thank you.
That is my understanding. That is how I choose to understand the word mystic. To me, as Swami Vivekananda says, one person has this experience. It's open to everyone. You cannot say this person can have or this person can do. Mysticism is open to all because that's our true nature. Our true nature is divine. So to me, anyone who can aspire to that and to realize that, have some experience of themselves as something other than this limited body and mind, they can be called a mystic if they have that experience.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mataji Pranam, this is Rita from Athens, Georgia.
Hi.
Hi. My question is related to the word mind. In Vedanta, I think we use the word antarkarana.
Yes.
And it's also, I am not sure about the connection. You also mentioned another word, speech. So speech has 4 aspects to it. Vaikhari, Madhyama, Pashyanti, Para.
Right.
So if we are trying to remove the boundaries and to go into no boundary awareness, how would that work out between the Antarkaran and the, I'm guessing you're trying to get us to Pashyanti and Para or beyond. So what is the procedure there?
So I didn't want to go into a lot, because of time, and then just the technicality of all the 4 layers of speech and sound and mind, etc. So as we know, as you said, in Vedanta, we have a little bit more, shall we say, sophisticated idea of the word mind as opposed to Western psychologists. So in Vedanta, mind is divided into 4 categories, as you know. Okay, so you have, the manas, ahankara, vitti, etc., chitta. So all 4 of these function together as the internal organ or the antakarana. So when I'm referring to mind, I'm referring to the whole antakarana, because the antakarana, there where you say manas, this mind weighs the pros and cons, and the buddhi is the determinative faculty, the chitta is the memory, the hankara is this identification or the ego. So that whole unit, this antakarana, this whole unit is what I mean by mind. Just to clarify that. Okay, speech, what I'm talking about is the everyday speech, the verbalization, not the subtlest form of speech, but the speech that just as we're talking now, which is the grossest form of speech. I mean, when you think about it, the connection between words and the thoughts, ideas, and speech, they're all connected. So the sound of the word is connected to the meaning of the word. You can't have one without the other, is what I'm saying. So you cannot separate them in that sense. So in order to get beyond the boundaries of speech and mind, as we're talking about here through this practice, we have to first of all understand the connection to begin with. So that was the main point that I was trying to make. Is that the speech, our ideas, our words, our thoughts, how they're connected. Does that make sense? Somehow
Yes, it does. It does. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Without going into the details of the subtlety, the various subtle forms of sound, as we know, the sound gets finer and finer and finer and finer till it becomes, the mystic syllable om. And as Ramakrishna says, when he has to come down so many steps before he can utter the Gayatri or whatever.
Yes.
So, yes. So I'm basically referring to the grosser forms of speech.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
Jai.
Mataji, our deepest thanks for your time and for these sublime teachings. It is so lovely to see you again, and we pray that we'll see you in person before too long.
That would be lovely.
So again, on behalf of all of us, thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.